My husband secretly recorded me sleeping for months and sent videos to his friends to rate my positions. I'd been married to Rick for 3 years when I started noticing weird things. We had a good marriage before this. Both worked regular jobs, him at a warehouse, me at a medical billing office. We'd cook dinner together, watch reality shows, normal married people stuff. His friends liked me, my friends tolerated him, and we were talking about kids next year. Then one morning I woke up and his phone was on the nightstand pointing at me. I asked why, and he said he must have knocked it over reaching for water. Made sense, moved on. But then it kept happening. I'd wake up at random times and catch this little red recording light. When I confronted him, he said I was paranoid. A week later, I pretended to sleep and watched through barely open eyes as he carefully positioned his phone against the lamp to record me. When I suddenly asked what he was doing, he jumped and said he was checking the time. I grabbed his phone and found dozens of videos of me sleeping. Just me lying there, mouth open, drooling sometimes, hair all crazy. Some were 20 minutes long, some had zoom-ins on my face. I asked him what the hell this was about. He said it was sweet, that he liked watching me peacefully. I told him it was creepy and to delete everything. He said he did, but I knew he didn't because our cloud storage was suddenly full. After that, he got sneakier. I'd find his tablet tucked between books on the shelf, recording. His laptop was positioned weirdly on the dresser. Once I found a whole camera I didn't know we owned hidden behind the plant in our bedroom. Every time I caught him, he'd apologize, say he'd stop. Then I'd find another device recording me 2 nights later. I started sleeping badly, always wondering if I was being filmed. The breaking point was when I was sick with the flu. Fever, couldn't breathe through my nose, looked absolutely terrible. I woke up at 3 a.m. to pee and saw his phone propped on his pillow, recording while he was in the living room gaming. I checked his phone later and found he'd sent videos to his group chat with his buddies. They were rating my sleeping positions and making jokes about my snoring. His friend Doug said I looked like a dead seal. Another guy, Tony, made some gross comment about what position I sleep in. Rick responded with laughing emojis. That's when I really started paying attention to Rick's habits. Turns out my husband had this weird thing about his sleep. He needed perfect conditions. White noise machine, blackout curtains, special pillow he paid $200 for, wouldn't let me turn on any lights if I got up to pee. He took melatonin every night at exactly 10:30. If anything disrupted his 8 hours, he'd be miserable for days. He literally had a sleep tracking app and would show me his sleep score every morning like I cared. His whole family knew not to call after 9 because Rick needed his wind down time. His mom once apologized to me for calling at 9:15 about a family emergency. So I decided if he wanted to document my sleep, I'd help him understand what bad sleep really looked like. Started simple. I'd wait until he hit deep sleep around midnight, then I'd suddenly gasp really loud like I was choking. He'd jump awake in panic, check on me, I'd pretend to still be asleep. Did this randomly, maybe twice a week. He started looking exhausted. Then I stepped it up. Downloaded this app that makes subtle, creepy sounds on a timer. Whispers, creaking, scratching noises. Set it to go off at random times between 2 and 5 a.m. Volume just loud enough to wake him, but not enough to figure out where it came from. He became convinced we had mice in the walls. Had an exterminator come twice. Guy found nothing. I started sleepwalking. Never done it before in my life, but suddenly I'd get up at 3 a.m. and just stand by his side of the bed. He'd wake up to me just standing there, staring at nothing. When he'd try to guide me back to bed, I'd mumble nonsense about cameras watching us. He started sleeping with one eye open. The masterpiece was when his brother Kyle was visiting. Kyle knew about the videos because he was in that group chat. Thought it was hilarious. So while they were both sleeping, I set up Rick's own camera to record him. But first, I put makeup on him while he was knocked out on his melatonin. Nothing crazy, just enough to look weird. Lipstick, some eyeshadow, and drawn-on eyebrows. Then I recorded him sleeping like that for an hour. The next morning, I sent the video to his group chat from his phone while he was in the shower. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. His phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter while water ran in the bathroom. I stood there making coffee and watched the screen light up over and over, message after message popping onto the lock screen. The preview texts were enough to see what was happening. Dude, WTF is this from someone named Brad? LMAO, did you lose a bet? From another number. 3 laughing emoji from Doug. I picked up the phone and unlocked it with the same passcode he'd been using since we got married. The one he never thought to change. The group chat was going crazy. Someone asked if this was a prank. Tony made a joke about Rick joining a drag show. Another guy I didn't recognize posted a screenshot of Rick's sleeping face with the makeup and added, 10 out of 10 would not bang. They were ripping him apart the same way they'd ripped me apart when I was sick with the flu, drooling and congested. The shower turned off. I set the phone back down exactly where it was and went back to pouring my coffee, adding creamer slowly while my hands stayed completely steady. Rick came out of the bathroom in his work clothes, hair still damp, and reached for his phone without looking at me. He was probably planning to check his sleep score like he did every single morning. I watched his face as he picked it up and saw the notifications. His expression went from normal to confused in about 2 seconds. He unlocked the phone and started scrolling, and I could see the exact moment he understood what happened, because all the color drained out of his face. His mouth opened a little. He kept scrolling and scrolling, reading message after message, and his hands started shaking. He looked at me standing there with my coffee mug, then back at his phone, then at me again. He walked over fast and held the phone up between us. "How did you get into my phone? Did you send this?" His voice came out higher than normal. I took a sip of coffee and looked at him over the rim of the mug. "Same passcode you've had for 3 years. And yes, I sent it. Now you know how it feels to have people judge you while you're asleep and can't defend yourself." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "This is completely different. What I did was sweet. I was just watching you sleep because I love you. You put makeup on me and sent it to my friends to humiliate me." I set down my coffee mug harder than I meant to, and it made a loud clink against the counter. "Sweet? You recorded me without my permission for months. You sent videos of me drooling and snoring to your buddies so they could rate my body and make jokes. Doug said I looked like a dead seal. Tony made gross comments about my sleeping positions, and you responded with laughing emoji like it was the funniest thing you'd ever seen." Rick's face went from white to red. They were just joking around. Guys joke like that. It didn't mean anything. I felt something hot and sharp rise up in my chest. I never consented to being filmed. I never agreed to have strangers look at videos of my body when I was vulnerable and asleep. You violated my privacy for entertainment and shared it with people I barely know. So yeah, I made you experience a tiny fraction of what that feels like, and now you're upset because your friends are laughing at you the way you all laughed at me. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out for a second. Then he said, "You've been torturing me for weeks. The sounds, the standing over me, the fake choking. Do you have any idea what that's been like? I can't sleep. I can't function. I got in trouble at work because I'm exhausted all the time. You did this on purpose to mess with my head." I grabbed the edge of the counter because my hands wanted to shake and I wouldn't let them. "You're right. I did it on purpose, because you wouldn't stop recording me no matter how many times I asked. You'd apologize and promise to delete everything, and then I'd find another camera hidden in the bedroom. You made me paranoid in my own home. I couldn't relax or sleep because I never knew if you were filming me. So I made sure you understood what it's like to not feel safe when you're trying to sleep." Rick's jaw clenched. "That's psychological torture. You deliberately prevented me from sleeping for weeks. That's abuse." The word hung in the air between us like smoke. And secretly recording someone's body without consent isn't abuse? Sharing intimate videos with your friends isn't a violation? You're only calling it torture now that you're the one who can't sleep. We stood there in the kitchen yelling at each other while his phone kept buzzing with new messages from the group chat. I brought up every time I'd found a camera and he'd lied about it. He brought up the exterminator visits and how much money we wasted because I was making fake mouse sounds. I threw back the hours I'd spent wondering if I was filmed every time I changed clothes or got out of the shower. He accused me of being vindictive and cruel. I told him he was a creep who violated his wife's privacy for months. Our voices got louder and louder until I was pretty sure the neighbors could hear every word. Neither of us would back down. Neither of us would apologize. We just kept throwing hurt at each other like weapons until we both ran out of things to say and stood there breathing hard and glaring. Rick grabbed his keys off the hook by the door. "I'm going to stay with Reese for a few days. I can't be here right now." He didn't look at me when he said it. He just walked into the bedroom and I heard him throwing clothes into a bag. I stayed in the kitchen listening to drawers opening and closing, the closet door sliding, his footsteps moving back and forth. When he came back out with his duffel bag and his work boots, he still wouldn't make eye contact. He walked past me to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Then he left, and the apartment door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than if he'd slammed it. The silence after he left felt wrong. The apartment was too quiet without his white noise machine running or his footsteps in the other room or the sound of him getting ready for work. I stood in the kitchen for a long time just staring at my cold coffee. The satisfaction I'd felt watching him read those messages was already fading into something hollow and uncomfortable in my chest. I'd wanted him to feel humiliated the way I felt humiliated. I'd wanted him to understand what he'd done to me. But now that it was done, I just felt empty. The revenge hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't made me trust him again. It hadn't erased the months of secret recordings or the comments his friends made about my body. All it did was make both of us hurt and angry, and now he was gone. I called Alina during my lunch break at work because I needed to talk to someone who wasn't involved in the whole mess. She picked up on the second ring, and I just started talking, telling her everything from the beginning. The recordings, the group chat, the revenge campaign with the sounds and the fake sleepwalking and the makeup video. I told her about the fight this morning and Rick leaving to stay with his brother. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "Okay, so he violated your privacy in a really creepy way, and that's not okay. But you've spent weeks focused on making him suffer instead of dealing with how hurt and betrayed you actually feel. And now you're both miserable and the relationship is falling apart. So what do you actually want here? Do you want to keep punishing him? Or do you want to figure out if there's anything left worth saving?" I sat there in my car in the office parking lot holding my phone and couldn't answer her question. I'd been so focused on revenge that I hadn't thought about what came after. I hadn't dealt with the actual feelings underneath all the anger. The hurt of knowing my husband filmed me without consent. The humiliation of his friends raiding my sleeping body. The violation of finding cameras hidden around our bedroom. I'd just channeled all of it into making Rick feel as bad as I felt. But Alina was right. Making him suffer hadn't healed anything. It just created more damage on top of the damage that was already there. My phone rang 2 days later while I was sitting on the couch in sweatpants eating cereal for dinner. The caller ID showed a name I recognized from Rick's group chat. Joey. I almost didn't answer because I had no idea why one of Rick's friends would be calling me directly. We'd met maybe 3 times at barbecues and barely talked. But curiosity won, and I picked up. He started talking before I could even say hello. "Hey, so I know this is weird me calling you, but I wanted to apologize for the stuff we said in the group chat about the videos. We all thought it was just Rick being an adoring husband who thought you were cute when you sleep. He made it seem innocent and funny. None of us knew he was recording you without your permission, or that you had no idea these videos existed." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "And then I heard about the sleep deprivation stuff you did to get back at him, and it made me realize this whole situation is way more serious than just stupid guy jokes. What Rick did was really messed up, and we shouldn't have been laughing about it." I didn't know what to say for a second. I'd been angry at all of them for months, imagining them sitting around making jokes about my body. Hearing Joey actually apologize made something shift in my chest. "Thanks for saying that. It means something." He was quiet for a minute, then said, "For what it's worth, I think you're both pretty messed up right now. What he did was wrong. What you did back was also pretty intense. You guys need to figure out if you can fix this or if it's too broken." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about what he said. Too broken. The words kept repeating in my head. I spent the next 2 days barely sleeping in the apartment that felt contaminated by everything that happened. Every time I walked into the bedroom, I saw the spots where Rick had hidden cameras. The shelf where his tablet recorded me. The dresser where his laptop sat at a weird angle pointing at the bed. The plant that concealed the camera I didn't know we owned. But I also saw the places where I'd set up the creepy sound app. The side of the bed where I'd stood at 3 in the morning staring at him until he woke up terrified. We'd both turned our home into a battlefield. Neither of us could feel safe or comfortable here anymore. The bedroom especially felt poisoned. I tried sleeping on the couch, but that didn't help because the whole apartment carried the weight of what we'd done to each other. My phone buzzed with a text from Rick on the 3rd day. "Can we talk? Coffee shop on Maple?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Okay." We agreed to meet at 2. I got there first and grabbed a table by the window. When Rick walked in 10 minutes later, I barely recognized him. He had dark circles under his eyes that made him look sick. His shoulders slumped forward instead of his usual confident posture. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung looser than they should. He sat down across from me and we just looked at each other for a minute without saying anything. He looked terrible. Exhausted and defeated and sad. I probably didn't look much better. Rick cleared his throat and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said what he did was wrong, that he didn't really understand how violated I must have felt until he went through his own version of it. The sleep problems and constant paranoia made him see how much control someone has over you when your own bed doesn't feel safe anymore. He apologized for putting me through that first, and his voice cracked a little on the last word. I watched him fidget with the cardboard sleeve on his cup and noticed his fingernails were bitten down more than usual. He looked genuinely sorry, which should have made me feel better, but somehow didn't. I told him I didn't know if sorry fixed anything. The trust was just gone from both directions now. He'd filmed me for months without permission and shared those videos with his friends like I was some kind of entertainment. Then I'd tortured him psychologically until his health fell apart, and his job performance tanked. We'd both crossed lines that felt impossible to uncross. Rick nodded slowly and stared at the table between us. A woman at the next table laughed at something on her phone, and the normal sound felt wrong in our heavy conversation. He suggested marriage counseling after a long pause. Said he'd do whatever it took to fix things and rebuild what we used to have. I almost laughed because counseling felt like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. How could sitting in some office talking about our feelings erase months of betrayal and revenge? But I agreed to try one session just to see if anything was salvageable. Maybe I was scared of being alone, or maybe some small part of me still remembered loving him before everything went bad. We scheduled an appointment for the following week with a counselor his insurance covered. The counselor's office smelled like lavender and had too many plants on the windowsill. She was an older woman with gray hair pulled back and these kind but serious eyes that made me feel like she'd heard every terrible thing people could do to each other. Rick and I sat on opposite ends of a beige couch that was trying too hard to be comfortable. The counselor asked us to explain why we were there, and we both started talking at once, then stopped. Then Rick gestured for me to go first. I laid out the whole timeline, the phone pointing at me that first morning, finding dozens of videos, him getting sneakier with tablets and laptops and hidden cameras, the group chat where his friends rated my sleeping positions and compared me to a dead seal. My voice stayed steady through most of it, but cracked when I got to the part about being sick with the flu and still being recorded. Rick sat there looking at his hands while I talked. Then it was his turn, and he explained his perspective, though it sounded more like excuses at first. He said he thought the videos were sweet, that watching me sleep made him feel connected. He admitted sending them to his friends were stupid, but claimed he didn't think it was a big deal because they were just joking around. Then he got to my revenge campaign and his voice got quieter. The fake choking sounds that woke him up in panic. The creepy noise app that convinced him we had mice. Me standing by his bed at 3 a.m. staring at nothing. The makeup video sent to his group chat. He said the sleep deprivation made him miss work and almost lose his job. The counselor listened to everything without her expression changing much. When we finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she told us straight out that we were dealing with serious violations of trust and consent from both sides. Rebuilding from this point would take major work from both of us, and she wasn't sure we were ready for that level of commitment. She asked if we'd both be willing to do individual therapy alongside couples counseling. We both said yes, even though I wasn't convinced it would help. Rick moved back into the apartment 3 days later but took the guest room. We existed in this weird space where we were technically trying to fix things but couldn't stand being near each other. Every interaction felt loaded with everything we'd done. Making breakfast turned into a negotiation about who got the kitchen first. Deciding what to watch on TV became a silent standoff where we'd both just scroll on our phones instead. One night I suggested ordering pizza and Rick said he didn't care, so I ordered what I wanted and he got mad that I didn't ask about toppings, even though he'd said he didn't care. We fought about pizza toppings for 20 minutes like that was the real problem, instead of months of betrayal and psychological warfare. I started staying late at work just to avoid going home. Rick did the same. We'd pass each other in the hallway and mumble hello without making eye contact. The apartment felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in because we were both trying to take up as little space as possible while still existing in the same place. At night, I'd hear him moving around in the guest room, probably not sleeping any better than I was. The white noise machine was gone. So were the blackout curtains and the expensive pillow. I wondered if he'd thrown them out or just couldn't use them anymore without thinking about everything that happened. Rick came home early one Tuesday looking worse than usual. He went straight to the guest room and closed the door. I gave him space for an hour, then knocked to ask if he wanted dinner. He opened the door and told me his boss had pulled him aside that afternoon. Asked if everything was okay at home because Rick's performance had dropped way off. He'd called in sick 3 times in 2 weeks, missed a delivery deadline, showed up late twice. His boss didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. One more problem and Rick might be out of a job. He'd made up some excuse about a stomach bug, but his boss didn't look convinced. Rick sat on the edge of the guest bed with his head in his hands. He said he hadn't realized how bad the sleep stuff had gotten until his boss pointed out all the ways it was affecting his work. The warehouse job wasn't fancy, but it paid decent and had good benefits. Losing it would mess up everything, especially now with counseling costs and potentially splitting up. I stood in the doorway not knowing what to say. Part of me felt guilty because I'd caused the sleep problems that led to this, but another part remembered all those videos and the group chat and felt like maybe he deserved some consequences. I settled on telling him I was sorry his job was at risk and left him alone. The next day at work, Alina pulled me into the break room during lunch. She had this look on her face that meant she knew something I didn't want to hear. She asked if Rick's sister Mercedes knew anyone at our office. I said maybe. Why? Alina explained that apparently Mercedes had mentioned something about trouble in my marriage to someone who knew someone who worked in billing. Now people were talking. Nothing specific, thank God, but enough that coworkers were giving me sympathetic looks and asking careful questions about how I was doing. I wanted to disappear under my desk. The idea of people at work knowing anything about my personal disaster made my skin crawl. I asked Alina what exactly people were saying. She said just that my marriage was going through a rough patch and I might be separating from my husband. Could be worse, but it still felt horrible having my private life become office gossip. I spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact with everyone and eating lunch at my desk instead of the break room. When Janet from Accounts Receivable asked if I was okay, I said I was fine with a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. The second counseling session the following week went worse than the first. The counselor wanted to focus on communication and boundaries, which sounded good in theory. But every time Rick tried to explain his side, it came out wrong. He kept calling the recording thing a mistake in judgment, like he'd accidentally filmed me instead of doing it deliberately for months. I got defensive about the revenge tactics, saying he deserved to know how it felt. We talked in circles for 40 minutes, getting nowhere. Finally, the counselor held up her hand and interrupted us. She said we weren't ready for reconciliation work yet because neither of us could take full responsibility for what we'd done. We were both still too focused on justifying our actions and blaming the other person. She suggested we each do 2 weeks of individual therapy before coming back for another couples session. Maybe working through our own stuff separately would help us actually hear each other. Rick agreed immediately. I nodded, but inside I was thinking this whole thing was pointless. You can't therapy your way out of broken trust. My phone rang while I was making dinner that Thursday. Unknown number, but local area code, so I answered. The voice on the other end said his name was Corbin, and he was one of Rick's friends from the group chat. I recognized the name as the guy who'd called me a dead seal. My first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity kept me on the line. Corbin started apologizing before I could say anything. He said he'd heard about everything that went down with the makeup video and the sleep revenge stuff. He wanted me to know he felt bad about the comments he'd made in the group chat. He explained that Rick always made the videos seem innocent and sweet, like he was just an adoring husband who thought I was cute when I slept. None of them realized Rick was filming without my knowledge or consent. They thought I knew about it and was okay with it, which obviously made the jokes seem less awful at the time. Hearing that I had no idea changed how Corbin saw the whole situation. He said what Rick did was creepy and wrong and he was sorry for being part of it. I thanked him for calling because it did mean something to hear an actual apology from one of them. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen thinking about how Rick had presented the videos to his friends. Of course he'd made it seem harmless. He probably convinced himself it was harmless too. Work got overwhelming the next week. A patient called to dispute a bill for a procedure their insurance should have covered. I pulled up their account and saw the claim had been denied for some technical reason that wasn't their fault or ours. Just insurance company nonsense. The patient was upset and I tried to explain the situation, but they kept talking over me, getting louder. I felt tears starting and excused myself quickly, practically running to the bathroom. Locked myself in a stall and just cried. Everything felt too big and wrong. The marriage falling apart, Rick's job problems, office gossip, the counseling sessions that weren't helping. The patient's angry voice echoing in my head mixed with memories of finding those videos and Rick's friends laughing about my snoring. I couldn't stop crying even though I knew I needed to pull myself together and get back to work. Alina found me 10 minutes later. She must have noticed me leave and came to check. She talked me into taking a personal day, saying she'd cover for me with our supervisor. She drove me home even though it was the middle of her shift. Made me tea in my own kitchen while I sat on the couch feeling empty. I admitted out loud for the first time that I didn't think the marriage could be saved. The words felt huge and scary. Alina sat next to me and said that was okay, that sometimes things break too badly to fix. She stayed for 2 hours just keeping me company until I felt steady enough to be alone. That evening I sat on the couch staring at the apartment walls while Rick moved around in the kitchen making tea. The silence between us felt heavy and wrong. I knew what I needed to say, but the words stuck in my throat. Finally, I just blurted it out. I told him we needed to separate for real, not just sleep in different rooms, but actually live apart for a while. His face went pale and he set down his mug so hard tea sloshed over the rim. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. We spent the next hour sitting at the kitchen table going over logistics in flat, exhausted voices. Who keeps the apartment? How to split bills? What to tell our families? Every practical detail felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Rick kept rubbing his eyes and I noticed his hands were shaking. He finally agreed to move in with his brother Reese temporarily while we figured out next steps. The next morning, I watched Rick pack his clothes and toiletries into suitcases. He moved slowly like his body hurt. He folded each shirt carefully, and lined up his shoes in neat rows in the second suitcase. The whole thing felt surreal and final, like I was watching our marriage actually end in real time through the simple act of separating belongings. He packed his fancy pillow and the white noise machine, his sleep-tracking app charger, the melatonin bottle from the bathroom. All the things that used to annoy me now just made me sad. When he zipped up the last suitcase, the sound echoed in the quiet apartment. He stood there holding both bags, looking at me like he wanted to say something important, but couldn't find the words. Then he just walked out and closed the door behind him. The apartment felt too quiet after Rick left. I walked through each room expecting to hear his white noise machine or the sound of him moving around. The bedroom looked wrong without his stuff on the dresser. The bathroom felt empty without his toothbrush by the sink. I kept catching myself listening for him even though I knew he was gone. That first night, I couldn't sleep at all. The silence pressed down on me like a weight. I realized that despite everything, despite the recordings and the revenge and all the hurt, I'd gotten used to having him here. Now the silence was its own kind of punishment. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. Maybe we could have worked it out somehow. Maybe I'd given up too easily. But then I remembered his friends laughing at me in that group chat, and the feeling of being watched while I slept, and I knew we were too broken to fix. 3 days later, I went to the counseling session alone. Rick texted me an hour before saying he couldn't make it because of a work emergency. I almost canceled, but decided to go anyway. The counselor looked surprised when I showed up by myself. She asked where Rick was, and I explained about the work thing. She nodded and said we could use the time to talk individually. She asked me what I wanted from the relationship. Did I want to fix things, or was I just afraid of being alone and starting over? The question hit me hard. I sat there picking at my fingernails, trying to figure out the honest answer. Part of me missed Rick, missed the good parts of our marriage before everything went wrong. But another part of me felt relieved to have space from him. The counselor waited patiently while I worked through my thoughts out loud. By the end of the session, I still didn't have a clear answer, but at least I was asking myself the right questions. Rick's sister Mercedes called me 2 days later. I saw her name on my phone and my stomach dropped. I expected her to defend Rick or blame me for the separation. Instead, she started by saying Rick had told her everything about the recordings and my revenge. She said she loved her brother, but what he did was creepy and wrong. She understood why I couldn't just forgive and move on. Hearing her say that made me tear up. I'd been so worried that everyone would take his side and think I was the bad guy for my revenge tactics. Mercedes said Rick was staying with Reese and seemed really depressed. He barely ate and spent most of his time sleeping or staring at his phone. She wanted me to know she wasn't calling to pressure me into getting back together. She just thought I should know how he was doing. We talked for almost an hour about marriage and trust and whether some things are too broken to repair. She didn't have answers, but it helped to talk to someone who understood both sides. That night, I started looking at apartments I could afford on my own. I pulled up rental listings on my laptop and browsed through pages of available places. The prices were depressing. Everything in my budget was either tiny or far from my office or in sketchy neighborhoods. I clicked through photos of sad little studios with stained carpets and outdated appliances. One place had bars on the windows. Another had a bathroom so small you'd have to stand in the shower to use the toilet. But seeing the actual numbers made the possibility of living alone feel more real and less scary. I bookmarked a few places that seemed tolerable and thought about what furniture I'd need. Would Rick let me take the couch? Did I want the couch with all its memories of our fights? I stayed up until 2 a.m. looking at apartments and making lists of what I'd need to buy. Rick showed up at the apartment unannounced 5 days later. I heard his key in the lock and felt my heart jump. When he walked in, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. His face looked gray, and he had dark circles under his eyes worse than I'd ever seen. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and put his head in his hands. Then he told me he'd gotten written up at work for his recent performance issues and poor attendance. His boss made it clear that one more problem could mean termination. The news hit me like a punch to the stomach. Rick losing his job would mess up everything, not just for him, but for both of us financially. We still had joint accounts and shared debt. If he couldn't pay his half of things, I'd be stuck covering everything on my medical billing salary. He looked up at me with this desperate expression, asking what he should do. I didn't have an answer. We ended up talking for hours that night, really talking for the first time since everything exploded. Rick admitted he started recording me because he felt disconnected from me. Watching me sleep made him feel close to me in a weird way. He said it out loud like he knew how messed up it sounded but couldn't explain it any better. He kept saying he knew it didn't excuse the violation or the fact that he shared videos without my consent. His voice broke when he talked about how stupid he'd been to send those videos to his friends. He said he never thought about how I'd feel if I found out. He just wanted his buddies to think his wife was cute or something. The explanation made me angry all over again, but at least he was finally being honest about his twisted logic. I told Rick about the full extent of the revenge campaign. I admitted details I hadn't mentioned before, like the creepy sound app and how I deliberately stood over him to trigger his paranoia. I explained how I'd planned each sleep disruption to make him as miserable as possible. He got really quiet while I talked. His face went pale and his hands started shaking. Then he told me he'd had nightmares about me standing there watching him. He'd wake up in the middle of the night at Reese's place thinking I was in the room. Hearing me admit I did it on purpose made him realize how genuinely scared he'd been during those weeks. He said he understood now what it felt like to not feel safe in your own space, to always be waiting for something bad to happen. His voice was barely a whisper when he said he was sorry for making me feel that way first. We both started crying, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. We were mourning what we used to have before the recordings, and revenge destroyed it. Rick reached toward me at one point and I almost took his hand. But I pulled back at the last second and he did too. We both knew that physical comfort wouldn't fix the broken trust between us. The trust was gone and probably never coming back. We sat there crying separately for what felt like hours. Eventually, Rick stood up and said he should go. He walked to the door and turned back to look at me one more time. Then he left and I heard his car start in the parking lot. I stayed on the couch until the sun came up, thinking about everything we'd lost and wondering if either of us would ever feel whole again. Rick looked at me across the couch with those tired eyes and asked if I thought we could ever get past this. The question hung in the air between us like something heavy. I opened my mouth and then closed it again. Finally, I told him I honestly didn't know. The recordings made me feel violated and unsafe in my own home. My revenge made him feel the same way. Now we were two people who hurt each other badly and didn't know how to exist together without that hurt coloring everything. He nodded slowly, like he expected that answer but hoped for something different. We sat there in silence for another few minutes before he stood up and left without saying goodbye. The next counseling session happened 3 days later. Rick showed up 10 minutes early and I got there right on time. We sat in our usual spots on opposite ends of the counselor's couch. The counselor, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun, asked us what we wanted to focus on today. Rick looked at me and I looked at the floor. She waited. Finally, I said, I didn't know if I could forgive him for what he did. Rick said he didn't know if he could forgive me either. The counselor nodded and started talking about forgiveness, and whether it was possible to forgive someone while still choosing not to stay with them. She explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. Sometimes the healthiest choice was to forgive and still walk away from a relationship that had become toxic. Her words made sense in my head, but my chest felt tight hearing them out loud. Rick wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The counselor asked if we'd thought about what we actually wanted from this marriage. Did we want to rebuild, or were we just going through the motions because divorce felt too final and scary? Neither of us had a good answer. The session ended with homework to think about what we truly wanted versus what we felt obligated to want. 2 days after that session, Reese called me out of nowhere. Rick's brother and I had never been particularly close. We'd exchanged pleasantries at family gatherings, and that was about it. I almost didn't answer when his name popped up on my phone. But curiosity won, and I picked up. Reese asked how I was doing in that careful way people use when they already know things are bad. I said I was fine. He said Rick wasn't fine. Rick was staying at his place and barely sleeping even without my interference. Reese thought Rick was dealing with guilt and depression, but wouldn't admit it or get help. Rick just went to work, came home, stared at his phone for hours, then laid in bed staring at the ceiling. Reese had tried talking to him, but Rick shut down every conversation. He asked if I knew what was going on with Rick's mental state. I told him about the counseling and the separation, and how neither of us knew what we were doing anymore. Reese sighed into the phone. He said his brother needed more help than just marriage counseling. He asked if I could talk to Rick about seeing someone individually. I promised I'd try. I texted Rick that afternoon asking if we could meet up to talk. He agreed to come by the apartment that evening. When he showed up, he looked even worse than at counseling. His hair was messy and his clothes looked slept in. I made us both coffee and we sat at the kitchen table. I told him what Reese said about him barely functioning. Rick got defensive at first, saying Reese was exaggerating and he was handling things fine. I pointed out that he'd gotten written up at work and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I suggested he talk to a therapist individually, not just our marriage counselor. The sleep issues and paranoia seemed bigger than just our relationship problems. He was resistant, crossing his arms and saying therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems. I reminded him his job was at risk. He needed to function regardless of what happened with us. That seemed to get through to him. He sat there quiet for a minute, then asked if I really thought it would help. I said I didn't know, but it couldn't hurt. He agreed to look into finding someone. Before he left, he thanked me for caring enough to bring it up. The gratitude in his voice made my throat tight. 2 weeks crawled by with minimal contact between us. I focused on work and spent evenings watching shows I'd saved up. One night, Alina convinced me to download a dating app, just to see what was out there. I created a profile using old photos from before everything fell apart. Within an hour, I had matches and messages. A guy named Marcus seemed nice enough, worked in IT, liked hiking and trying new restaurants. We chatted for a few days, then he asked me out for coffee. I said yes, mostly to see if I could imagine myself with someone else. The date was fine. Marcus was polite and funny and asked good questions. But I felt guilty the entire time, even though Rick and I were separated and I wasn't technically doing anything wrong. Every time Marcus laughed at something I said, I thought about Rick's laugh. When Marcus touched my hand across the table, I pulled back automatically. I realized halfway through the date that I wasn't ready to move on yet, even though the marriage might be over. I told Marcus I had a good time but wasn't in the right headspace for dating. He was understanding about it. I went home and deleted the app. 3 days later, Rick sent me a text at 11 at night asking if I was already replacing him. My stomach dropped. I asked what he was talking about. He sent a screenshot of my dating profile that someone had apparently sent him, probably a mutual friend who saw me on the app. The text fight that followed was ugly. He accused me of moving on before we'd even figured out what we were doing. I shot back that we were separated and I could do whatever I wanted. He said I was proving I never actually cared about fixing things. I told him he had no right to be mad after what he did. We went back and forth like that for an hour, both of us saying things designed to hurt. Finally, I told him to leave me alone and blocked his number. He must have blocked mine too because my next text wouldn't deliver. I threw my phone across the room and cried angry tears into my pillow. Alina showed up at my apartment the next morning with bagels and coffee. She'd texted asking if I was okay, and when I didn't respond, she just came over. I let her in and told her about the fight. She listened while I ranted about Rick being a hypocrite, and how unfair it was that he got to be mad about a single date when he'd violated my privacy for months. When I finally ran out of steam, Alina said I needed to unblock Rick and actually talk to him about boundaries and expectations during the separation. Fighting over text and then blocking each other wasn't solving anything. I said I didn't want to talk to him. She pointed out that we were still married and had shared finances and couldn't just ignore each other forever. She was right, but I hated it. That afternoon, I unblocked Rick and sent a message asking if we could meet to establish some ground rules. He agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd had our conversation after he moved out. Rick got there first and had already ordered my usual drink. The gesture felt loaded with meaning. We sat down and I pulled out my phone to take notes. I said we needed clear boundaries for the separation. Rick nodded. We agreed we were separated but not dating other people yet. We'd communicate about practical matters like bills and the apartment lease. We'd both keep going to counseling individually and together to figure out what we wanted. No more blocking each other or fighting over text. If we needed to argue, we'd do it in person or in counseling where someone could mediate. Rick added that we should be honest about our mental states and not hide if one of us was struggling. I agreed to that. Writing it all down made the separation feel more real and structured instead of this messy limbo we'd been in. Before we left, Rick mentioned he'd found a therapist and had his first appointment scheduled. I told him I was proud of him for taking that step. 3 weeks later, Rick texted asking if we could grab lunch. When we met up, he looked better than he had in months. Still tired, but more present somehow. He told me his therapist thought he had control issues and anxiety that showed up in the sleep obsession and recording behavior. He was working on understanding why he felt the need to document and control his environment so rigidly. Hearing him talk about it without making excuses or trying to minimize what he did made something shift in my chest. This was the first time I'd felt a glimmer of hope that maybe he actually understood the severity of what he'd done. I asked what else he was working on in therapy. He said learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of trying to control everything around him to feel safe. Learning that his need for perfect conditions was actually making his anxiety worse, not better. I told him I was glad the therapy was helping. He asked how I was doing. I said I was okay, which was mostly true. My own therapy appointment happened 2 days after that lunch. I'd been seeing someone individually for a few weeks, but hadn't gone into detail about the revenge campaign. This session, I decided to tell her everything. The fake choking gasps, the creepy sound app, standing over Rick while he slept, the makeup video sent to his friends. My therapist listened without visible judgment, but I could see her taking notes. When I finished, she asked me hard questions about why I chose psychological torture instead of just leaving or confronting Rick directly. I tried to explain that I wanted him to understand how it felt. She pushed back gently. asking if I really thought making him suffer would heal my own hurt. I had to admit that part of me wanted him to suffer the way I suffered. That impulse to cause pain scared me about what kind of person I was capable of being when I was hurt. My therapist said that was an important realization. Recognizing our capacity for cruelty was the first step in making sure we didn't act on those impulses again. The session left me feeling raw and exposed. The family gathering happened because Rick's mom insisted on a Sunday dinner and wouldn't take no for an answer. Both our families were there, crowded into his parents' house. Rick and I had been avoiding family events, but his mom said it had been too long and she missed seeing us. We showed up separately, which his mom noticed immediately. Throughout dinner, people kept asking where we were living now and why we came in different cars. Finally, Rick's mom asked directly if everything was okay with us. The table went quiet. Rick and I looked at each other across the pot roast. I said we were separated and figuring things out. His mom's face crumpled. She asked if we were getting divorced. Rick said we didn't know yet. My parents looked concerned but stayed quiet. Rick's sister Mercedes asked what happened. I gave a sanitized version about trust issues and needing space. Rick added that we were both in therapy and trying to work through things. His mom started crying, saying she'd hoped we'd give her grandchildren. The rest of dinner was awkward and tense. People tried to make normal conversation, but everything felt forced. When I left, my mom hugged me tight and whispered that she supported whatever I decided. Rick's mom wouldn't look at me. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. Rick and I sat in chairs that didn't match, separated by a small table with a box of tissues on it. The lawyer was a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd heard every terrible marriage story already, and ours wouldn't shock her. She pulled out a folder and started explaining how divorce worked in our state. Division of assets meant splitting everything we owned down the middle, or figuring out who bought what and when. The apartment lease was in both our names, so we'd need to decide who stayed or if we both moved out. She talked about timelines, how it would take at least 6 months from filing to finalization if we agreed on everything, longer if we fought about stuff. The costs added up fast when she listed filing fees and her hourly rate and court costs. Rick asked about the house we'd been saving for, the down payment sitting in our joint savings account. She said that would be split too unless we agreed otherwise. Hearing her lay it all out in legal terms made everything feel heavy and real in a way our fights never did. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was paperwork and signatures and dividing up the life we'd built together piece by piece. When we left the office an hour later, neither of us said anything until we got to the parking lot. Rick asked if I wanted to grab lunch and I said no. I needed to be alone. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after he drove away, staring at the steering wheel and feeling like I couldn't breathe right. I made it halfway home before I had to pull over because I was crying too hard to see the road. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel and my chest felt tight like someone was sitting on it. The lawyer's words kept playing in my head about splitting assets and finalizing the divorce and moving forward separately. I grabbed my phone and called Rick without thinking it through. He answered on the second ring and I just started crying harder when I heard his voice. I told him I wasn't ready for this, that sitting in that office made everything too real, and I didn't know if I could actually go through with ending our marriage. He was quiet for a second, then said he felt the same way after leaving. Neither of us wanted to give up completely even though we'd hurt each other so badly. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour, both of us crying and talking about how we got to this point. Rick said he'd do anything to fix things if I was willing to try. I said we needed to give counseling a real shot, not just go through the motions but actually work on our problems. We agreed to commit to 3 more months of serious therapy before making any final decisions about divorce. If we couldn't fix things in that time, at least we'd know we tried everything. When we hung up, I felt exhausted, but also like maybe there was a tiny bit of hope left. The breakthrough happened in our 4th joint counseling session after we recommitted. The counselor asked Rick to explain why he recorded me, and instead of his usual excuses about it being sweet or wanting to feel close to me, he just sat there quiet for a long time. Then he said it was a violation, and he knew that now. He said he took away my ability to consent to being filmed and shared those videos without my permission, and that was wrong no matter what his intentions were. He stopped trying to minimize it or make it sound less serious than it was. The counselor turned to me and asked about the revenge campaign. I'd been justifying it for weeks, saying Rick deserved to feel scared and exhausted after what he did to me. But sitting there listening to myself talk, I realized I'd crossed serious ethical lines too. I'd deliberately tortured him psychologically for weeks, made him paranoid and sleep-deprived to the point where his job and health suffered. I told the counselor that I'd become someone cruel when I was hurt, and that scared me about what I was capable of doing to people. Rick reached over and took my hand, which surprised me. We both cried while the counselor talked about how we'd both violated each other's trust and safety in different ways. For the first time since everything exploded, We weren't fighting about who was worse or who started it. We were just two people who'd hurt each other badly and needed to figure out if we could heal. The counselor suggested we practice talking outside of sessions, so Rick and I started meeting for coffee once a week. The first time was so awkward I almost left before he showed up. We sat across from each other at a table by the window and tried to remember how to have a normal conversation. The counselor had taught us this thing where you talk about neutral topics first, before getting into anything heavy. So we talked about work and the weather and this show we used to watch together. Rick told me about a guy at the warehouse who got caught sleeping in the bathroom for the third time. I told him about my coworker's drama with her teenage daughter. It felt forced and weird at first, like we were strangers on a bad first date. But after a few meetings, it got a little easier. We could talk about our families without it turning into a fight about whose family handled the separation better. We could discuss plans for the weekend without bringing up the recordings or revenge. One time, Rick made a joke about something stupid his friend said, and I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months around him. It was just a small moment, but it felt like progress. We weren't fixed, but we were remembering how to exist together without everything being about the past. Rick texted me one afternoon while I was at work with news about a promotion. His boss had noticed his performance improving over the past month and offered him a supervisor position with better pay and regular hours instead of the rotating shifts he'd been working. He sent me 3 excited texts in a row with details about the new responsibilities and pay increase. I felt genuinely happy for him reading those messages. I texted back congratulations and asked if he wanted to celebrate with dinner. We met at this Italian place near his work, and he talked about the promotion with real excitement in his voice. His sleep had gotten better with therapy and regular sleep patterns instead of my interference, and that helped him focus at work again. Watching him talk about his future plans and goals, I realized I wasn't feeling bitter or resentful about his success. I was actually proud of him for turning things around after everything fell apart. That feeling surprised me because I'd spent so long wanting him to suffer. Being able to celebrate something good happening to him without my own hurt getting in the way felt like real progress toward healing. I found a small 1-bedroom apartment I could afford on my own about 20 minutes from work. The place was nothing special, but it had good light and the landlord seemed normal. I called Rick and asked if he'd help me move my stuff from our shared apartment. He showed up on moving day with his truck, and we spent hours packing boxes and loading furniture. It was weird going through our shared space and dividing things up. I took the cheap couch we'd bought at a thrift store when we first got married. He kept the TV and the coffee table his mom gave us. We had to figure out who got which dishes and towels and all the random stuff you accumulate living together. Some things we just split down the middle. Working together to carry boxes and furniture down 3 flights of stairs felt both sad and healing at the same time. We were acknowledging that we needed separate spaces to figure out if we could ever share space again. Rick helped me unload everything at the new place and set up my bed frame. Before he left, he stood in my empty living room and said the apartment was nice and he hoped I'd be happy here. I thanked him for helping and we hugged briefly at the door. After he drove away, I sat on my couch in my own place for the first time and cried because it felt like the end of something, even though we were supposedly still trying to work things out. 3 months into serious counseling work, the counselor suggested we try a reconnection date. She explained it as a chance to see if we could enjoy each other's company the way we used to before everything fell apart. We picked this restaurant we used to love, a little Mexican place with good margaritas and live music on weekends. Before we went, we agreed not to talk about the recordings or the revenge or therapy or any of the heavy stuff. Just dinner like a normal couple. I changed my outfit 3 times before leaving my apartment because I was nervous in a way I hadn't been around Rick in years. We met at the restaurant and he was already at a table when I walked in. He stood up when he saw me and pulled out my chair, which was something he used to do when we first started dating. We ordered our usual dishes and talked about safe topics. Rick told me about his new responsibilities at work. I talked about this true crime podcast I'd been listening to. The conversation flowed easier than I expected. The live band started playing and Rick asked if I remembered the first time we came here. I did. We'd gotten so drunk on margaritas that we walked home instead of driving and got lost for an hour. Remembering that night made us both laugh, and suddenly we were swapping other memories from early in our relationship. The time his car broke down on our way to his parents' house. The awful apartment we looked at that had a toilet in the kitchen. The way we used to cook dinner together and dance in the kitchen. For a couple hours, we were just us again without all the hurt between us. The drive home from the restaurant felt different. Rick offered to drive me back to my apartment, and we sat in his truck outside my building talking. He said he'd had a really good time tonight and forgot how much he enjoyed just being with me. I admitted the same thing. But then we both got quiet because we knew having one good night didn't mean everything was fixed. Rick brought up how the foundation of trust between us was still cracked, even if we could have good moments. I agreed that we'd done serious damage to each other that wouldn't disappear just because we could laugh together again. We talked about whether we were actually rebuilding something or just delaying the inevitable end. Neither of us had an answer. Rick asked if I thought we'd ever get back to what we had before. I told him honestly that I didn't think we could go back, but maybe we could build something different if we both kept working. We sat in the truck for another 30 minutes going in circles about the same questions. Finally, I said I should go inside and get some sleep. Rick kissed my cheek before I got out, which he hadn't done in months. I went up to my apartment feeling confused about whether tonight was progress or just a reminder of what we'd lost. The next counseling session got heavy when Rick admitted he'd been having nightmares. He said he kept dreaming about me standing over him watching him sleep, and even though he knew rationally I wasn't doing that anymore, the paranoia stuck with him. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone was in his room. He'd installed extra locks on his door at his brother's place and started sleeping with a light on. Hearing him describe how my revenge affected him long-term made something shift in my chest. I'd known I scared him during those weeks, but I didn't fully understand that I'd given him actual trauma that lasted beyond the immediate revenge. The counselor asked how that made me feel, and I had to sit with the question for a minute. I felt genuinely sorry in a way I hadn't let myself feel before. I'd been so focused on justifying my actions as deserved punishment that I didn't let myself see the real harm I caused. I looked at Rick and apologized without any excuses or qualifications. Just a straight apology for traumatizing him and making him feel unsafe in his own home. He looked surprised and said thank you. The counselor pointed out this was the first time either of us had taken full responsibility without defending ourselves, and that was significant progress. The counselor turned to me and asked if I had any lingering effects from Rick's recordings. I'd been trying not to think about it too much, but once she asked, everything came up. I told them how I still check for cameras in any bedroom I'm in, even at hotels or friends' houses. My eyes automatically scan for little red recording lights or devices positioned weird. I have trouble sleeping anywhere because I'm always aware someone might be watching. Even in my own apartment where I know there are no cameras, I sometimes can't shake the feeling of being observed. I told Rick about how I bought blackout curtains and covers for my laptop camera and a device that detects hidden cameras. The paranoia became part of my daily routine in a way I couldn't seem to shake. Rick looked upset hearing all this and said he was sorry again. The counselor let us sit with that for a minute, then said something that hit hard. She pointed out that we'd both traumatized each other in ways that wouldn't disappear with apologies and therapy. These were real psychological impacts that might last years or forever. That reality was sobering because it meant even if we stayed together and worked through everything else, we'd both be carrying these scars. We'd both always be the person who hurt the other in a fundamental way. Neither of us said anything for the rest of the session. We just sat there holding that truth between us. The next session felt different from the moment we walked in. The counselor had this serious look on her face and she didn't waste time with small talk. She asked us straight out if we thought the marriage could recover. The silence stretched out so long I could hear the clock ticking on her wall. Rick shifted in his seat, cleared his throat twice, then finally spoke. He said he loved me, but didn't know if love was enough when we'd hurt each other this badly. His voice cracked a little on the word badly. I looked at my hands and agreed that maybe the healthiest thing was to let each other go and work on healing separately. Saying it out loud made it real in a way all our fights and separation hadn't. The counselor nodded slowly and said she thought that was a mature decision. She told us she'd support whatever we decided, but that continuing to hurt each other while trying to fix things wasn't helping anyone. We spent the next session talking about how to separate in the healthiest way possible. The counselor had this whole plan about maintaining boundaries during the divorce process and continuing individual therapy. She said we needed to decide if we wanted to stay in contact or go completely separate ways. Rick said he thought some contact made sense for practical stuff, but that we should probably not try to be friends right away. I agreed because the idea of casual friendship felt impossible when I still had so much hurt. We made the decision to move forward with divorce, not out of anger but out of acceptance that we'd become toxic to each other. The counselor wrote down some recommendations for divorce mediators and reminded us both that ending a marriage didn't mean we'd failed, just that we'd grown in different directions. Walking out of that office felt lighter somehow, like we'd finally stopped fighting gravity. Filing for divorce turned out to be surprisingly boring. Just paperwork and signatures and a clerk who looked like she'd processed 1,000 of these and would process 1,000 more. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and old carpet. Rick and I sat next to each other filling out forms, and at one point our hands bumped reaching for the same pen. We both pulled back like we'd been shocked. The whole thing took maybe 2 hours, and then we had a court date months away. Standing outside the courthouse afterward, neither of us knew what to say. Rick suggested lunch, which seemed weird, but also necessary. We went to this diner we used to go to sometimes and talked about practical things like dividing furniture and updating our families. I told him he could have the white noise machine and the fancy pillow. He said I could keep the coffee maker since I actually used it. There was a strange peace in having made a clear decision after months of uncertainty. We weren't happy exactly, but we weren't fighting anymore either. My new apartment was small, but it was mine. I spent a whole weekend decorating and organizing and creating a space that felt entirely like me. I bought new curtains, not blackout ones, just regular curtains that let morning light in. I set up my bedroom however I wanted without worrying about someone else's sleep schedule. There were no cameras, no hidden recordings, no devices tucked in weird places. The freedom to control my own environment without considering someone else's rigid requirements felt amazing. I could turn on lights at night if I needed to pee. I could stay up late watching TV in bed. I could sleep however I wanted without wondering if someone was filming me. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m. and just lay there enjoying the silence and the safety. No white noise machine, no paranoia, just me in my own space. I heard through Alina that Rick started dating someone new a few months later. She'd seen him at the grocery store with a woman, looking comfortable and happy. It stung when she first told me, that sharp feeling in your chest when you hear your ex moved on. But then I sat with it for a while and realized I wasn't devastated. I'd been grieving the marriage for so long that the actual end felt more like relief than loss. The woman wasn't anyone I knew, which made it easier somehow. I didn't torture myself imagining them together or comparing myself to her. I just felt this weird acceptance that Rick was living his life, and I was living mine, and those lives didn't overlap anymore. Alina asked if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I was. She looked surprised but pleased. I went on a few dates myself through a dating app. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with different guys to see what was out there. I found that I was way more cautious about privacy and boundaries than I used to be. On the second date with this guy named Mark, he made a joke about checking my phone and I shut that down immediately. I told potential partners up front that I needed to take things slow, and if they seemed pushy or dismissive of boundaries, I ended it right there. I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off instead of ignoring red flags like I did with Rick. One guy seemed great until he mentioned he had cameras in every room of his house for security. I finished my coffee and left. Maybe it was innocent, maybe not, but I wasn't taking chances anymore. The divorce got finalized on a random Tuesday in April. I took the afternoon off work to process the emotions. The hearing lasted maybe 15 minutes. The judge asked some basic questions, verified we'd agreed on everything, signed some papers, and that was it. 3 years of marriage ended in a courtroom that smelled like floor cleaner. I walked out into the spring sunshine and felt sad, but also lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy for months and finally set it down. I sat in my car for a while just breathing. Then I called Alina and asked if she wanted to go out for dinner to mark the occasion. She said absolutely, and that she was proud of me. We went to this Italian place and I ordered wine and pasta and let myself feel whatever came up without judging it. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Rick at the grocery store. I was in the produce section trying to figure out which apples to buy when I heard someone say my name. I turned around and there he was, looking healthy and rested. We had a brief conversation that felt surprisingly normal. He asked how I was doing. I asked about his job. He mentioned he'd moved into a new place. I told him about my promotion at work. We talked for maybe 5 minutes and I realized I didn't feel angry or hurt seeing him anymore. Just this distant fondness for someone I used to know well. He looked different somehow, more relaxed, and I wondered if I looked different to him too. We said goodbye and went our separate ways in the store, and I felt okay about it. Not happy, not sad, just okay. I started sleeping better in my own apartment. The hyper-awareness of cameras faded gradually. I stopped checking every corner and scanning for recording lights. The bedroom felt safe again, truly safe, in a way it hadn't since I first discovered Rick's videos. I could sleep with my mouth open and my hair messy and not care because no one was watching or judging or sharing videos with their friends. Living alone helped me reclaim the privacy and peace that the recordings and revenge both destroyed. Some nights I'd wake up and just appreciate the silence and the safety. No paranoia, no fear, just sleep. I bought myself nice sheets and a comfortable pillow and made my bedroom into a place I actually wanted to be instead of a battlefield. A year after the divorce, I sat in my apartment one evening and reflected on everything that happened. We both made terrible choices that hurt each other badly. The recordings were a violation I'd never fully get over. Sometimes I still checked for cameras in hotel rooms or at friends' houses. That paranoia became part of me in a way I couldn't completely shake. And my revenge crossed lines I wasn't proud of. I'd deliberately terrorized Rick and destroyed his sleep and his sense of safety. I couldn't pretend that was okay just because he hurt me first. but I'd learned important lessons about boundaries and consent and healthy ways to handle betrayal. I learned that revenge doesn't actually heal anything. I learned that some violations are unforgivable, and that's okay. I learned to trust my instincts and walk away when something feels wrong. The marriage ended badly, but I came out of it stronger and more aware of what I needed and deserved. 3 months after the divorce was final, my boss called me into her office, and I thought maybe I was in trouble for something. Instead, she offered me a promotion to senior billing specialist with a 15% pay raise and my own small team to manage. I said yes immediately without even thinking about it, because for the first time in years, I felt like I could handle more responsibility instead of barely keeping my head above water. The extra money meant I could afford a nicer apartment or save for actual vacation instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. I started the new role 2 weeks later and discovered I was actually good at managing people and solving problems when my brain wasn't consumed with revenge plots or marriage drama. My coworkers congratulated me and took me out for drinks after work, and I realized I'd been so wrapped up in the Rick situation that I'd stopped being a real person with goals and ambitions beyond just getting through each day. On what would have been our 5th wedding anniversary, my phone buzzed with a text from Rick. I almost didn't open it because I figured it would either be angry or pathetic, but instead it just said he was sorry for everything and hoped I was doing well. I sat with my coffee and stared at the message for a while, then wrote back that I appreciated him reaching out and hoped he was happy and healthy too. We texted back and forth for maybe 10 minutes, just simple stuff about how we were both doing better now and how the divorce was probably the right choice even though getting there sucked. He mentioned he was seeing someone new and asked if I was dating, and I told him I'd gone on a few dates but nothing serious yet. The conversation felt weird but not bad, like talking to someone I used to know in college instead of someone who violated my privacy for months. We ended by agreeing we were better apart and wishing each other well, and I actually meant it, instead of just being polite. My therapist suggested I look into support groups for people dealing with privacy violations, so I found one that met Tuesday evenings at a community center downtown. The first meeting, I walked into a room with 8 other people sitting in a circle, and when it was my turn to share, I told them about the sleep recordings and how I still checked hotel rooms for cameras 2 years later. Hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone, because they all understood the specific violation of having your private moments turned into entertainment without your consent. One woman had her ex install cameras in her bathroom, another guy had his roommate recording him changing clothes, and we all nodded when someone described the paranoia that never fully goes away. I kept going to meetings every week and found myself opening up more about the revenge stuff too, admitting I'd crossed lines trying to hurt Rick back, and that guilt sat heavy sometimes. The group didn't judge me for it, just listened and shared their own complicated feelings about wanting revenge versus wanting healing, and slowly I started feeling less broken. 2 years after everything exploded with Rick, I met someone at a friend's birthday party who actually listened when I explained my boundaries about privacy and consent. We started dating slowly, having actual conversations about comfort levels and what we both needed to feel safe in a relationship. He never tried to rush me into anything physical, and checked in constantly about whether I was okay with how things were progressing. I told him about the recordings on our 4th date, because I wanted him to understand why I was careful about certain things, and he just nodded and said he respected that, and would never do anything to make me feel watched or violated. We've been together 6 months now, and I'm genuinely happy in ways I didn't think were possible after the Rick disaster. I can sleep next to him without wondering if he's filming me, and when he says he respects my boundaries, I actually believe him because he proves it with his actions every single day. Looking back at everything that happened, the recordings and revenge and divorce all felt terrible while I was living through it, but I came out stronger and smarter about what healthy relationships actually look like, and I wouldn't trade that knowledge for anything.